Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're speaking on the day when the French president has been addressing business leaders from all over the world here in Paris. He's appealing to the private sector ahead of a big climate change conference that's taking place at the end of the year here in the French capital. With us, Sonny Kapoor, Managing Director at Redefine. Tell us about Redefine.
We advise governments, central banks, finance ministries, and large investment funds on financial sector, macroeconomics, environment, and development.
All right. An ambitious in-tray, as it were.
Nothing less.
Nothing less. Also with us, Rajendra Shende, Chairman of Terre Policy, non-governmental organization that fights for the environment. Mark Lewis, Senior Analyst in Sustainability Research at the firm Kepler Chevreux. And Francis Perrin, the man who cracks the whip at SPE Oil and Gas Newsletters. Welcome back to all of you. Yeah, this conference taking place in Paris, I was going to ask, when these business leaders come here, is it really to have a public-private enterprise discussion, or Sonny Kapoor, is it kind of a PR stunt? It looks good to be listening to the French president lecture you on climate change.
Well, not showing your face here is a reputational risk. So I think that's a starting point. Now, that is not to say that there are people here who are not more motivated than just managing reputational risk. But there are few and far between. There are companies who have, for entirely self-interested business purposes and seeing economic opportunity, made up their mind that this is the next big play, this is where opportunities lie, this is where they can distinguish themselves from their peer, perhaps even command premiums for appearing more ethical and seeing business opportunities in renewable energy, etc. Those are out there, and they are actually actively pushing the agenda. There's companies there for defensive reasons, for example, insurance and reinsurance firms, who see a threat to their business model posed by climate change, an existential threat. And then there's a whole slew of companies who are here to be seen to be with the right people in the right place at the right time. And of course, the biggest problem is everybody who's not here.
All right, everybody who's not here. For you, who's the biggest no-show?
Well,
Come on, how about some naming and shaming here?
I don't want to get sued.
Rajendra Shende?
Well, I think I agree with Sony, what he's talking about. I think there is a large section of the business community who has not waited for this particular conference, or not waited for any advice or any strong argument from presidents of France. I think they have got going because there is a sense of making a business in a particular direction. The example which Mark gave was renewable energy. I mean, there are revolutions which are taken place in the last 20 years. Many of them have gone ahead without government intervention, the IT technology. And the same revolution we see in renewable energy, where 5 years back, the estimates made by the World Bank, International Energy Agency, United Nations agencies have all gone wrong, not only by a few margins of sensitivity, but 6 to 7 times.
Yeah, they didn't think they would be profitable, and they are.
And in terms of the capacity and the share of energy production, or the share of electricity production by renewable energy, have totally dismantled the estimated models of projecting what will be the renewable energy capacity by 2010. And that continues. And remember one more thing, that continues in spite of the financial crisis facing most of the world. And when we talk about the growth today in Europe, we are scared to talk more than 2%. Now, these renewable energy growth models were more than 50% per year. This was a revolution. And I think if that continues, if that is incentivized by President Hollande, then I think probably the world will be on a track to achieve what is expected to be achieved in Paris.
All right, and carbon, fossil fuels, they require big investments up front. And we saw last weekend 2 bits of news, both concerning the Shell oil company. Last weekend, protests in Seattle. Protesters angry over Shell's plan to drill in the Arctic, the same Shell that's been drawing heat for being a member of the American Legislative Council, a Washington lobbying firm that fights policies that try to tackle climate change. Activists who, by the way, also say that ultimately Climate change and the switch to renewables make investing in oil risky. But this week, at Royal Dutch Shell's annual meeting, Chief Executive Ben van Beurden dismissed what he calls carbon bubble claims as ignoring reality. He said the reality is 80% of the total energy system is made up by fossil fuels. It has been for many decades and will be for many more decades to come. Francis Perrin, it's safe for you to stay in the oil and gas business, reporting on oil and gas?
Well, it's a profitable business, and it has been for a long time. Of course, it depends on the level of oil prices. When you have oil prices at $100 per barrel or more, as during 2011 and the end of the first half of last year, you make very good profits in oil and gas production. With lower oil prices, it's less good. But what is right is that fossil fuels, so coal, oil and natural gas, represent today about 80%, a little more, of world energy supply. And this proportion will, of course, go down, but it will be a lengthy process. It depends on which studies you rely on, but let's say that in about 20 years from now, perhaps the share of fossil fuels could be, according to the International Energy Agency, which is based in Paris, perhaps 75%. So we will live yet for a long time.
And the forecasters can't be wrong in the way Rajendra was mentioning a moment ago?
Well, you may make many forecast scenarios and projections, but you have some scenarios and forecasts which are very interesting, but rather theoretical. And in the real world, you have a lot of constraints due to strategies and policies by states, by companies, inertia, by public opinion, etc., etc. I think that it's a matter of fact, we will live as a world for a long time with fossil fuels being dominant within energy supply. We have, of course, to lower this share. We have to push up energy efficiency, which is the most important priority, and renewable energies. And you have some oil companies which are involved in energy efficiency and renewable energies. Total is one of the leaders in solar energy, in photovoltaic conversion with the US company SunPower, for instance. So you have many interesting things, but you must take into account reality. When you are world dominated at about 80%, with fossil fuels, you cannot change this situation overnight.
Can't change the situation overnight, and basically the boss of Shell saying oil is still a very, very safe bet. Again, he dismisses this carbon bubble claim.
Yeah, I think he's wrong. I think he's absolutely wrong. I see from the oil industry today, and I hear from the oil industry today, exactly the same message that we heard from the European utility industry 10 years ago. Renewables will never be able to compete with fossil fuels. We're going to be depending on coal-fired power generation for, if not decades to come, for many, many years to come. The European utility landscape has been completely redesigned beyond anybody's wildest imaginings just 10 years ago. And the European utility industry has had to write down billions and billions of euros worth of investment. The oil industry now, Mr. Van Beurden, looking to invest potentially billions of dollars in drilling in the Arctic. Your clip there showed some of the reaction to that from an environmental point of view. But even if we look at the pure economics, how can this ultimately make sense? You need a price probably in excess of certainly in excess of $100 a barrel to justify that. It's premised on the continuation of demand in the future because that's not something you can drill overnight and then all of a sudden it magically comes on stream the next day. It's going to be probably a decade if these investments go ahead before that oil starts flowing to consumers. Is the demand going to be there the way that Shell expects it to be? What if the Chinese and the Indians move very rapidly to taking up electric vehicles? That's because the IEA, nearly all of the demand growth for oil over the next 10, 20 years is expected to come from road transportation, mostly in Asia. What if those consumers leapfrogged the petrol-driven era for road transportation and moved directly to electric vehicles? China and India have every incentive possible to move very quickly towards electric vehicles. If that demand is not there, those investments that Shell and other oil companies are planning to make today in the Arctic, in oil sands, in these very expensive areas, will not be profitable, and they will have to write those assets down in exactly the same way the European utilities have had to write down their assets.
All right, one newspaper that really seems to have it in for Shell is The Guardian in Britain. Recently, they published a report showing that as far back as October 2011, Shell had started lobbying the European Commission, and successfully so, getting them to scrap their existing formula for linking carbon-cutting goals with binding renewable energy laws, instead saying natural gas is the way to go. This whole it gets back to what we were saying at the outset. Does this show up politicians as being the weak ones, if ever there is a test of wills with oil companies?
Yeah, I mean, for many of these, so first of all, Shell is by far from being the worst. I mean, one of the reasons everybody is sort of talking about Shell is they've been duplicitous. They've presented themselves as actually being one of the relatively good guys, and as has been clearly demonstrated, they're not that different from Exxon, for example, who are known to be the bad guy. Now, I just wanted to bring in 3 quick points. The first is, I mean, we have been here before, exactly as Mark was saying. It's a sunset industry and sunrise industry. We've seen this with Polaroid versus digital cameras. We've seen this in all sorts of other industries with mainframes.
But hang on,
versus
this isn't
laptops,
the same
etc.,
as Polaroid, is it? I mean, the point seems a compelling one when the boss of Shell tells you there's going to be 2 billion more people joining the middle class on this planet soon.
Well, there were going to be 2 billion more people demanding Polaroid cameras, right? Until a new technology replaced it and made it obsolete. The second point is, I mean, he has half a point, right? So given the rate at which demand for oil is going to diminish, there is a room for some hyper-efficient oil company to be making loads and loads of profit, but not the oil industry. Right? I mean, the oil industry as a whole will not be making profit, will be writing off huge amounts of money, as has happened in the past. Within that, there can be 1 or 2 good performers, but that's not what he's saying. So, I mean, he has half a point, but that was not what he was saying.
Rajendra Shinde.
I think the oil industry has become definitely a defensive one. And I think that statement of CEO of Shell tries to project probably stock exchange related PR things.
And when Francis Perrin mentions the French company Total investing heavily in solar, again, is that a PR move or is that sincere?
It may be a combination of PR as well as some good moves, because I think every private sector industry, coming from the private sector myself, would like not to stand on only one stool. I think they would like to make sure that there is some kind of a diversification. So I think coming back to the Shell CEO things, I think it is definitely he's become defensive. I think he has understood that the days for the oil industry, if not overnight, they will shut down, but they are limited. And I think the renewable energy efficiency stuff is going to pick up very fast. And I think it's going to be the people movement. It's going to come up bottom up, and not the president standing and telling business community do this. I think the business knows where the sunrise industry is, as Sony said it correctly.
Francis, in this country, I'm not feeling the groundswell. I saw the recent elections, the Greens got clobbered.
Yes, you are perfectly right. The awareness about environmental issues can be very different between France, Germany, Nordic states within Europe, etc. So here also you do not have something which is totally cohesive, and it's perfectly normal. And businesses and companies can of course be sensitive to their environment. In such and such an environment, you will think that you will have to adopt such and such an attitude. So there is, of course, a dimension of public relations, and if it leads these companies in the right direction, why not? But you also have business choices as far, for instance, as solar energy is concerned, as far as wind energy is concerned. These companies, these oil companies, say more and more, we are energy companies. With, of course, a very strong oil and gas content, and it will remain the case for many, many, many years. But for some time, they want to diversify, and they do different choices. For Total, it's solar and biomass, for instance. For another company, it will be other sources of energy. But solar energy is rising, especially photovoltaic conversion, which is considered as the most promising field within solar energy. Because solar energy means a lot of things.
We saw those protests earlier about drilling in the Arctic. We've seen, and this brings back to a point that Mark Lewis made a short while ago, and I'll put it to you, Sony, that with the price of oil dipping, there's less fracking in Western Canada right now. Oil sands drilling is slowing down. There's going to be big layoffs there. So these dirty fossil fuels, they're being sorted out by the markets? Or do you need at some point legislation to say stop, like it is here the case here in France, where you're not allowed to do fracking?
Well, I mean, to some extent, eventually market forces will prevail. What is unprofitable cannot go on forever. But a lot of damage has already been done. If you just look at, for example, the frequency of earthquakes, the last thing I saw, I think, was in The Economist in Oklahoma. That has gone up from 2 every year to about 600, and it's been directly linked to fracking. If you look at the environmental damage wrought through oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico, previously in the Arctic, what has happened in and around the tar sands area, what has been going on with flaring and the effect on air pollution, the state of the air in China, for example, from coal fire burning plants, etc. All of these things have already had a massive human cost, economic cost, as well as a cost for the future of the ecosystem. So a preventive move is always much more sensible than going in the wrong direction, as allowing, for example, Shell and others to drill in the Arctic and then say, well, eventually this will be shown to be unprofitable and they're going to shut down and go out of business. A lot of our money, it's going to be your pension fund money and my pension fund money and his, which is actually funding Shell, right? I mean, they get their money. It's the absence of shareholders holding corporate executives to account. The interests of corporate executives in Shell are very different from the interests of investors who eventually own Shell, and it's their inability to enforce that. There's going to be financial losses, there's going to be environmental costs, there's going to be human costs, none of which are necessary if we put a stop to this now.
All right, which brings us to a point that's been very topical of late, and that is this issue of divestment. In the 1980s, it was a push on college campuses in the U.S. to divest from companies that did business in apartheid South Africa. Today, after the Church of England, major universities in the UK divesting from fossil fuels, in the US, some as well. Oxford, the latest, with a push away from coal and oil sands. Not a complete divestment from fossil fuels, but an important one. Should there be divestment?
Well, look, I mean, it's difficult
Does
to
it
be...
make sense for these universities?
Well, look, I mean, people... This is a very interesting development, first thing to say. I don't think it's a coincidence that this is happening on university campuses. This is something that mobilises the younger generation. I think this is a hugely important point that's often missed in this debate, is that I speak at many conferences, and normally I'm speaking to middle-aged investment professionals or middle-aged analysts like myself. But I have...
Seasoned and wise.
Well, indeed. But I have...
You see young people like me.
But I have spoken at a couple of divestment conferences with younger students, and the energy in the room, for a start, is much greater. So I think there is a serious debate to be had here, an economic debate about whether or not divestment increases the cost of capital for doing business in these areas. That's ultimately the economic rationale for divestment, that you lower the liquidity of the stocks, and therefore you push up the cost of capital for the businesses that are affected, and over time the market reallocates capital. The economic argument against it is, well, actually, if you're divesting, you're selling almost by definition to other owners who are less concerned about these issues, and actually there's a risk that the activity will just go on, and you no longer have a voice at the table, you're not a shareholder anymore, and you lose the chance to engage. I think that's a reasonable debate to be had. But for me, the more significant point in a way is that it's mobilizing a very large voice here, which is the voice of a younger generation that ultimately will be much more affected by this problem than many of us who commentate on this. It's the younger generation that has the most to lose from climate change. And I think the fact that they are energizing on this issue, that is going to have very significant ramifications.
Rajendra, final word on this?
I agree on the mobilization part of it. I think it gives a good signal to the younger communities what exactly is going on in a financial modeling of the investment in the energy sector. But I think there is one more factor. I think all this divestment is happening in developed countries. And those are the signals which are being going. But the developing country youth, I'm sure they will be more charged by saying that whatever the investment you make today, make it in a decarbonized economy of the future, rather than a divestment. Because I think whatever the investment made in the developing country today is for the betterment of their own benefits and their generation. But I think now the time has come that whenever you make an investment, either in infrastructure or in a power plants or whatever it may be, that those investments are more emphasizing the renewable part of it and decarbonization of economy. And I think that will give the mobilization more value and mobilization will be more effective. So I think along with the divestment, which is a good thing, is an excellent signal, but I think there's a time has come to make sure that from today onwards, the investments made in infrastructure is going in a decarbonized way.
All right, so not just a push to divestment, but also a push to investment in renewables. Rajendra Shende, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Francis Perrin, Sonny Kapoor, and Mark Lewis. Stay with us, though, gentlemen. Our Media Watch segment is next. All right, we were talking about it earlier. Hello, Emma James.
Hi there.
How are you? We were talking about earlier about the push to get this into the headlines, this story.
Well, it seems to be there today in particular, not least because Barack Obama is talking about it. He has tweeted today that the best scientists in the world know that climate change is happening. Because, of course, one of the big problems that this argument has always faced is the climate change deniers. But Barack Obama is out there saying...
Which still exist on Capitol Hill, I hear.
Absolutely, and they still exist all around the world. It's quite spectacular. The White House has provided almost an idiot's guide to what we can expect from climate change. On one side, we see what happens if we act. Those are the temperatures far lower if we don't act.
Gosh, which would you choose?
They're in a rather violent orange colour. They've done the same thing when it comes to precipitation, sort of rainfall and everything, looking a lot worse if nobody acts on this. Now, the reason that the US is talking about this a lot today is because Obama is due to give a speech to the National Coast Guard, in which he's going to call climate change a threat to national security. Now, as one cynic put it, perhaps that's just a way to get a budget for it, because how else do you fund the battle against climate change other than to say this is a security threat? But his focus is very much on how rising seas, thawing permafrosts, longer wildfires will affect how people are kept safe in their own homes. Obviously, it's a big impact for individuals, but he's talking about what do we do with our armed forces? How do we tackle these kind of natural phenomenon and obviously the ones that are more man-made?
Startling argument on that, by the way, those Bangladeshi migrants leaving a country that could be submerged by water.
Absolutely. Well, it's funny you should mention migrants because The Independent today is reporting and presenting a really apocalyptic view of what we can expect. They say we're boiling ourselves to death, that temperatures on Earth hit another record high, and that it's the worst we've ever seen. 2015 is set to break those records yet again. We're only in May, 5 months in, but really not a good picture at all. Now, they then go on to detail what are the risks to human beings. Number one, they say malaria is going to be everywhere. They also talk about the fact that crops will die because many of them are very sensitive to temperatures. And they talk about migration because they say that will become even worse because people are seeking food, there'll be more natural disasters, there'll be coastal areas that are lost to erosion and the like. And so all of those problems are set to get far worse if we can't get a handle on this. And the picture's no better if we look at this article in Vox. The news on climate is awful, so now what? Well, this writer talks about the level of concessions that would be needed to actually prevent what we expect to see happening pretty soon, a 2-degree rise in temperature. And he says that basically the measures needed are so dramatic. And if we take a look at this little graph that he's posted, the orange line is where we are and where we're headed, which is for 4.9 degrees C. In order to reduce our emissions enough to have less than a 2-degree raise in temperature, then we're looking at the blue line right down there. So that's a huge cut in emissions, makes you feel that it's almost impossible. So if you read on, he says that basically there needs to be a fundamental shift in everything, how people view it on an individual level, but also politically. You would be forgiven for thinking that there's not a great deal of hope, which he's chosen to illustrate with this. But he says, where there is uncertainty, there is hope. And it would seem that's as optimistic as he's getting on the subject.
All right. We'll see. Of course, we've been arguing that perhaps by making it make better business sense, that there could be certainly a chance. I want to thank you, Emma. I want to thank our panel once again. Stay with us. There's more to come. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24.